Hello, welcome to Actual Spinster. My name's Anna Marie. Today I'm going to talk about Villette by Charlotte Bronte and Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. And I'm going to be doing that in a spoilery way because I want to talk about them like in depth. And I'm doing this as also like a kind of some Victober content, hopefully. I'm also going to be talking a bit about The Wooden Doctor by Margaret Evans, which I don't have a copy of here, so I haven't had the opportunity to reread it, but it is sort of related as well, I think, to kind of what I'm going to be talking about and like also just Villette in general, I guess. I think we'll start with Villette. I'll let you know when I'm going to go more in depth into spoilers, so some people can probably watch this for a bit. But Villette is about a woman called Lucy Snow who is an orphan, and she goes to a place called Villette in Belgium and becomes a school teacher there. And it's about her interactions with people she knew as a child. It's about her inner life, really. It's about falling in love. It's also kind of about like being depressed to some degree. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say about it as an introduction. And then Lucy is a novel about a main character called Lucy. I don't think we ever get her last name actually. And she is from the West Indies. I'm not sure if it's ever like specified more specifically. It could be Antigua. I think that's where Jamaica Kincaid was from. And it's about Lucy, who's I think 18 at the beginning of the novel, and it's just about her going to America to be a nanny or a carer for the children of this couple called Lewis and Mariah. And you know, she looks after their children and she develops a kind of relationship with Mariah, and kind of like through that relationship she also is like reflecting back on her relationship with her mother. I think she's quite like an angry and complicated and really vivid character. She's quite, I think, you know, some people would find her really unlikable. I would say she's probably quite an unreliable narrator. Yeah, and it's just quite like a short book. The margin around my book is pretty big. So yeah, it's really, really good. You know, especially I think if you're really interested in mother-daughter relationships, colonialism, yeah, just like... So, you can obviously immediately tell that like the names are the same. Obviously, this character is called Lucy, this character is called Lucy. It was only when I like posted about reading this that I found out that it was like sort of related. I wouldn't say like a retelling, but like related or like inspired by Villette. And that made me much more excited to read it because obviously, as you know, like Villette is one of my favourites. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to sort of talk about the similarities between these two and maybe how they speak to each other and expand on the meanings that one has by putting them with another. You get more, if that makes sense. I'm gonna go into the kind of like more of the plot now of Villette especially, but also I guess Lucy, although I feel like it's a bit less of a kind of spoilery book because like I said, it's very short, but also it's much more about like the character rather than the plot. Obviously Villette is too, but there is quite a lot of plot still. Yeah, and the plot kind of illuminates the character, or at least like how you discover the plot illuminates the character, maybe slightly more in Villette. So I got one of my friends to read this and she really liked it, and then we had some great conversations about it, and we also had conversations about Lucy, I think because she had also just read Lucy. And yeah, we were kind of talking about the similarities between the two, and something that I found I hadn't really thought about until we kind of properly put them together and were really thinking about the ways that they're connected was how Monsieur Poole, he ends the novel by almost returning, shall we say, from some kind of escapade in the West Indies. You don't get very much detail like at all about it, and it's, you know, there's no derision towards like what is happening, the colonization that's going on there. Does that make sense? Being very articulate as usual. Yeah, but that's kind of, it's this sort of like place he has to go to fulfill obligations to show that he's a good man because he's promised that he would help people, but ultimately look, he'll come back and, you know, it won't like affect him deeply, and he'll come back and get married to Lucy.
I mean, like, you could, I guess, to some extent argue in, like, a kind of against the grain reading that, like, the fact that Monsieur Paul dies is a way of Charlotte Bronte kind of indicating her, like, disregard for a colonial project that he has become embroiled in. But I think that gives Charlotte Bronte too much credit, so... But I definitely think, like, you could read some post-colonial stuff into the actual text, but I don't think you would necessarily be supported by Charlotte Bronte, but obviously, like, death of the author if you want, like, go for it. Yeah.
And then obviously in Lucy, it's somebody going from the West Indies to America, and kind of like that's an immediate switch in perspective. and in like a decolonial switch, I guess. Yeah, I think that's really clever. And it's quite subtle, because I mean, like, it's quite subtle in this. Like, I feel like, you know, it's easy to forget that that's where he's going, and it's just kind of, it's like suggested that it's like really not relevant, but of course, like, it is. I mean, all of these things are informing the society, like the wealth of the people. I mean, like, the wealth that people are getting, the wealth of the person that he's going to like deal with in the West Indies on behalf of is like made from like extractive and deeply exploitative practices. And then of course that really informs like the materiality of the people's lives. So it's like, it's silly to say that it's not relevant, but the way that people talk about it is as if it doesn't affect much because it's happening in somewhere else, in some place else. But then it's like this is like, you know, the someplace speak back in a way that feels also a little bit intangible, because obviously Lucy leaves the West Indies, and I think there's a very big connection between like where she grew up, like home, and her mother and stuff, like, and they had like a really tumultuous relationship, to say the least. So it is kind of a bit about like her moving away from her mother as well, but trying to keep herself, and to know that there is a connection between her mother and herself, but then also wanting to, yeah, separate from that. Hope that makes sense. The relationship between her and Mariah is like really interesting in this. Sorry, I really feel like I'm butchering all of this. These are really great books. You should read them if you haven't. And if you have, like, do let me know how you feel about them. Something that I really love about Villette is the way that we don't get we don't get reveals in the kind of way that you're like normally expecting to with a novel, i.e. like something happens and it's a first person narration, so you hear about it. But with Villette, like Lucy specifically, there's one moment that's very, very clear where she is looking in the mirror, like through a mirror actually, at Dr. John, and then it's described as like Dr. John becomes annoyed at this, and he maybe like he leaves, I can't remember, but he's clearly like annoyed at Lucy's like gaze upon him, and Lucy doesn't say anything apart from that about the experience. And then like a couple chapters later we get that actually Dr. John is a character called Graham, who Lucy Snow like grew up with to some degree, because he's the kid of her godmother. But because you don't get that for like quite a long time compared to like how quickly that she realised, which is like it tells you that she realises as she's looking into that mirror, and that's what, like, I think she like starts or something, and that's what draws John's attention to her, and then that's when she realises that it's him, it's Graham. So the whole time she's been, you know, just like obfuscating from you, which obviously then leads you to question like how much else she's been hiding. And yeah, that's just one of my favourite moments. I'm not sure if I had a wider point there. I think something I did want to also remember to talk about was the way that I feel like Villette is, and I think, you know, to some degree Lucy, like, because it kind of inherits some of that, maybe, you know, in a slightly different way, or yeah, maybe put in practice in a different way. I think that like Villette is almost a kind of like realist, or like a realistic Cinderella, because she has a godmother who's supposed to make her life better. She's supposed to like help her find people. She to some degree has kind of like two stepsisters, Paulina and Ginevra, but instead of being kind of ugly in the way that they're actually beautiful, which kind of harms Lucy's position in the world. I mean, both of them are to some degree, well, yeah, both of them are love interests for the person that she's in love with, and in part that's why she's unsuccessful with him, because I think like at the end, or like near the end, it's like kind of hinted that like maybe he was interested in her, but like it would only be if Paulina wasn't around. So, you know, that's sort of happening. And yeah, like yeah, so I think like thinking about it as a kind of Cinderella story is really interesting as well, because then it also for me makes me think about like other books like Mansfield Park, which is sort of a kind of a Cinderella informed story. Like there's, you know, like three sisters and all of this like very fairy tale energy of kind of like the three and the three, and then Fanny Price is like moved to a magical place and it's supposed to bring her a lot of joy and happiness and blah blah blah, but it doesn't. Like her, I can't remember if she's her godparent, but like stepmother or aunt or whatever is just like deeply underwhelming. And then she has two like step half whatever like people who are kind of surrogate sisters for her, and they are both like the ugly stepsister. They both behave badly, stuff like that, which I just think is, you know, I guess it's just another way that fairy tales are adapted into other stories and into books, or how they inform other stories. Obviously you can retell a fairy story and it can be like whimsical and just as whimsical, or even more whimsical than the kind of like original version. Obviously I know there's no such thing as like an original fairy story, but like I hope you get what I'm saying. Or you can, you know, make it into much more of a real story, in which case, I mean, then you kind of potentially make it be tragic. Because also the other thing is, obviously Cinderella does have like one parent, doesn't she, for a while, but then she becomes an orphan, and Lucy Snow is like quite quickly orphaned, like right at the beginning of the book. But either way, I do feel like it's very much in the same kind of textual area or whatever. So yeah, that's something interesting. So in terms of thinking about the Wooden Doctor, I think in the introduction to the edition I had, which is like a Hono Classics edition, they talk a bit about kind of the similarities between it and Villette, because this the Wooden Doctor is a story about a young woman. She comes from quite like a tumultuous home. She is sick fairly regularly. I think it's body pains, and when I read it I remember being like, that's basically fibromyalgia. I don't think that that is the specific thing that's trying to be represented, but it's a bodily sickness, which is very clearly to do with like desire and growing up.
I'm pretty sure that the way that her pain is described is that she's like got a fox inside of her, and it's like this kind of beast that is like scratching at her and like harming her and stuff, which I just thought was kind of like intriguing way to describe pain, so I thought I would mention that.
She basically falls in love with this Irish doctor who comes to look after her. So obviously you can see there, Doctor. I can't remember if he is called John in the book. We follow her, I think it focuses much more on her like younger years, so until she's about 21, and it is a much slimmer book as well, so I feel like that also changes the reading experience a bit. But yes, then she does also have this time where she takes like a stint in a French boarding school. I don't think it is Belgian, but I might be wrong. And she goes there and it's kind of awful and cold, and there's some like stuff going on that she's trying to figure out. Like, I don't think she's ever surveilled in quite the same way as Lucy is, but I think that there are some like undertones of that going on there, and I think there is some stuff about Catholicism as well. Something that I do love about Lucy is just how judgmental she is. Like, she hates Catholics so much, and it is quite funny. You know, there's a bit like near the beginning where she's describing the like schoolgirls that she's teaching, and she's just like, and French Catholic girls, they just always lie. So every time they go to confession, every single time they say, I am sorry, I've sinned, I lied, which, yeah, is adorable to me. Sorry, back to the Wooden Doctor though. That book ends in a very like abrupt and upsetting fashion. I think that in a way like it falls into quite like a sort of hetero-pessimist thing. I know that that's like a term that's been coined fairly recently, more in response I believe to like Sally Rooney stuff, but I definitely think that like the Wooden Doctor kind of prefigures some of that hetero-pessimism. You know, I think you probably could argue in a way that some of like Villette does too. Something I really love about, and I think that Lucy is also grappling with some of this as well, in part because she's very focused on her own like sensory experience. There's this like extremely vivid chapter where she talks about like making out with somebody and like sucking their tongue and things like that, and I feel like a lot of that is maybe partially, and again also the Wooden Doctor too I think has some strands of it, in part because of the main character's like illness with her body and how there's nothing wrong but there is something wrong. So it's kind of like all of the books are thinking about how we know things and how we try to find things out and how we see things and how we like the difference between seeing and knowing, or the similarities between seeing and knowing, or like when you think you know because you've seen X, or I don't know, those kind of contradictory but also like connected relationships between gathering a kind of knowledge about the world by living in it, and also gathering a kind of knowledge about the world by attempting to not live in it and attempting to look on almost like objectively as like a big eye in the sky. I don't remember if there's much in Lucy specifically about eyes, but in Villette there is a lot about eyes and sight and perspective and yeah, being surveilled by like Madame Beck and the people in the school, and also Monsieur Paul, like he watches Lucy a lot. Whilst like sexuality is definitely thought about in the Wooden Doctor, I don't remember if there's much like queerness about it, whereas I do feel like these two actually both have some queer stuff in there, and I think that that makes them better. Obviously. So Lucy develops like a friendship with, I think she's called Peggy, this girl, and I think Peggy is kind of like a stand-in for both maybe Paulina and also Ginevra, like all in one. And Peggy's like a punk, if I remember correctly. I think Peggy's also Irish actually. She's like kind of angry and complicated as well, and they kind of like end up almost not really being friends with each other, but they still are living together. And they have this thing where they like go to a park on the weekends and they try to like pick some guy to have sex with, and they never really do because Peggy's always saying, you know, that he's got something wrong with him basically. And instead sometimes they go home and they make out with each other, or I think, you know, sometimes they get drunk and they make out with each other and stuff like that. And, you know, Lucy definitely shows like desire for men, but I also think that like her relationship with Peggy is very much like a, well, I think it could to some degree be read as like romantic. I think it's definitely a fraught kind of romanticism, but it's obviously like a sexual relationship to some degree, or like could become more of one. And I think it's an element that is maybe often forgotten. Like Lucy, I think she's in the kind of like bisexual queer kind of area, and you know, Peggy too. So that adds to me something about like the experience of trying to find yourself, trying to figure out your sexuality, trying to experience the world and like gain all of these new experiences. And again, it is something that I would say connects it even further with Villette, because Villette has some definite like queer undertones or overtones or whatever, specifically I would say between Lucy Snow and Ginevra. And I think that especially comes to the fore during the scene where Lucy is forced to kind of play in the school play as a fop to Ginevra's like coquettish beauty, and Lucy refuses to wear like trousers, she refuses to wear the costume, she only wear like the jacket and stuff, which means she's performing it like in her big skirts. It's the type of scene that I think queer theorists go like crazy for, because it's a literal play, so obviously it's already having a conversation about a kind of performance, and sort of it's then maybe almost easier to read into like this level of performativity of all of the gender and sexual behaviours and desires of the characters. But Ginevra is also like vying for the attention of Dr. John at that point, so there's this kind of like rivalry. Instead of between Ginevra and Lucy for Dr. John, there is instead a rivalry between Dr. John and Lucy for Ginevra's attention. I think that really is, it's very interesting to read, it's very interesting and fun exploration of just like queer sexuality. Not anything particularly explicit or anything, and I'm not necessarily saying anything about like Charlotte Bronte, but I also do think that Charlotte Bronte was bisexual, but whatever. Like the reason I mentioned that she didn't do it in the costume or in the full costume also made me kind of more think about it as like a queer act, because I feel like taking on the outfit of a man in order to pretend to be one is maybe a bit different than taking on partially the outfit of a man in order to pretend to be one, because you're already kind of failing at that and like making it seem like, yeah, I don't know, you're still very much a woman, and you're also expressing desire for this girl, or you're participating in a game about desire for this girl. I think it's a really interesting scene to read. Lucy, like both Lucys, do just have this like amazing appetite for the world, and I think it's often described in kind of like flame-like or fire or like heat phrases. At the end of Lucy, like the reveal for me of like between Lucy and her mother of like when Lucy's sort of asking her mother about why she was born, or kind of like her, and she is like, I named you after Lucifer. I just thought that was like so incredible and iconic. So yeah, I think that was really fun. And then in this, Monsieur Paul and Lucy also both have this kind of fieriness to them, and sometimes they do talk about like souls, and obviously there's like a Catholic kind of imagery that's going on as well, because there's a way that Lucy refuses that Catholicism because she sees herself as a Protestant ascetic person rather than like a sensuous Catholic one. But the reality is that she isn't Snow. Lucy is very much like not a placid curtain of coolness. Instead, she's this like passionate and expressive and like sensual being, corporeal being, who actually loves sensation and, you know, yeah, appetite, desire, life. It's like actually being present and living it, not just being a passive observer or a kind of placater who just falls on top and doesn't affect anybody underneath, really. Like, I think it's a misnomer, but it's also like a fun play with the fact that she really is fiery. She shouldn't really be called Lucy Snow. She should be called like Lucifer, I don't know, Lucifer. But anyway, the other thing I wanted to talk about, I think this is the final thing I'm going to talk about, is just like appetite. So I did already kind of start talking about it, but something that I love about this book is I feel like sometimes, and maybe it happens a bit in Jane Eyre, where there's a kind of focus on like starving women of experience, of desire, of actual literal food, and whilst Lucy does get locked in a room and isn't able to eat and is just really hungry for one scene, I don't feel like there's that kind of sense that she should be starving throughout or anything. It's more like that demonstrates how much of an appetite for life she has, and Monsieur Paul like brings her these sweet cakes, and you know, to some degree I feel like she doesn't really fall in love with Monsieur Paul, she falls in love with the cakes that he brings her, and you know, to some degree I think that's kind of sweet. I also don't really think that she's in love with Monsieur Paul. Like, I think she chooses him because he's called like the inevitable and all of this stuff, and I think there's like things going on about like marriage and how she is desperately trying to find somebody who won't be like murdered in a storm. I don't mean murdered, I just mean killed like her family was. So she tries to find the most like sturdy and unbearable like steadfast and fiery person in order to like counteract a human vulnerability to like death. And of course it's not really successful. Anyway, wow, I got like detracted in my own, anyway, whatever. I think that like people's appetites tell you a lot about them, and I also think they're like one of the best things about them, not generally like, and I really like how I feel like this book kind of gets that. It's specifically for Lucy. I mean, there's also a bit where she's like a massive fatphobe about like a drawing of Cleopatra.
I ran out of card space as I was filming this video, and I did say that on camera, but it didn't catch that bit of me saying it, so this is me saying it now. Okay.
So I'm going to end this video here, quite abruptly I guess, sorry. Let me know if you have any thoughts about what I said, and I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Okay.